So I've seen a number of these worst to bests, and figured I'll have a crack at it. And what better band to start us all off with than one of my favorite progressive rock bands, and really one of the forefathers of progressive metal bands, Dream Theater. Now, I'm going to preface this as it is my own personal opinion about it. I don't really think I need to preface that, but my list is going to be different than your list. And also, Dream Theater really hasn't put out a bad album. Dream Theater really hasn't put out too many bad albums, and so we're going to talk about each one. It's not going to be a full-length review of each one. This is more of how each album fits within this discography of Dream Theater. Each album is different, and I want to talk about that, so let's dive in. So, starting us all off with arguably their worst album. As I said at the beginning, they haven't really put out too many bad albums, and in my mind, this is one of the bad albums. This is one album that I've really only listened to when it first came out. After it came out, I only really listened to it maybe once or twice. Now, the self-titled work came out in 2013, and this was the second album without Mike Portnoy, one of the founding members of the band. Each of the tracks, I felt like they had already done something similar and better. For example, some of the instrumentals, like the False Awakening Suite as well as the Enigma Machine, the band, upon promoting this album, said, "We're very excited to play some purely instrumental tracks because we hadn't done so in a while." But if you look at their purely instrumental tracks up to this point, the Yeats Jam, the Erotomania suite that begins the kind of 20-minute suite with an Awake, as well as Train of Thought's Stream of Consciousness, and even, I mean, the masterpiece that is The Dance of Eternity, each of these purely instrumental tracks really did something and really said something without having any lyrics. But the two tracks on here just kind of feel short, like they don't really do too much. The only saving grace that I have on here is the Illumination Theory. And even this is a almost paint-by-numbers ripoff of The Count of Tuscany. And out of all of the big epics that Dream Theater could reproduce, they chose their weakest one, and that's the highlights of the album as well, like the instrumentals, the Enemy Inside, as well as the Illumination Theory. These are the highlights, and when I'm complaining about the highlights, you know it's a downward slope from there. Some of these tracks are just, I almost want to say god-awful. The Looking Glass, The Bigger Picture, Behind the Veil, and Along for the Ride are just, I know they're trying to do that whole ballady metal thing, like almost the hair metal, but it just doesn't work. Okay, so let's talk about the Astonishing. I'm not going to say it's bad, because it's not. But it kinda is. It's one of the few albums I'll attach the word pretentious to. It's totally overblown. It is way too long. I tap out about midway through the first disc, and it's just bananas. I mean, this guy is 130 minutes long, and in some cases it works. I like the grand scale epic of it. I like the let's try something over the top, overblown, and just way out in left field. I admire that, but it just kind of falls apart. My problem is there's no meat on the bones of this album. At the end, I'm expecting this big epic payoff for this 130-minute bonanza, and I don't feel I got it. Like, I don't feel rewarded after listening to such a long stretch of music. There's no real point I can really pin down and say this was a great piece, and the only time I can kind of say that is with The New Beginning, the 19th track off of the first disc. The New Beginning, I thought, had a moment that I'm like, yeah, here we go. But as I said with my review of this album, the drumming is atrocious. The drumming is so bad, and it's not because Mangini isn't a bad drummer. I know he's a good drummer, but what he does on this album it's just very bland. Like, that's the only thing I can say, and that's kind of a good overarching concept of this, is that the album itself is very bland. Okay, so when Dream and Day unite, their debut album, the reason why this guy is so high up on the list here in terms of closer to the worst than their best is my familiarity with it. I'm not too familiar with this album. I've only sat down and really started listening to this in preparation for this worst to best list. This is one of the first albums within this list that I'll say is not a bad album. It really isn't. Actually, for a debut album, it's a great album. What it did culturally was it opened the doors for more of a progressive stance on metal. A lot of metal bands at the time had already been doing this. I mean, Faint's Warning and Queensryche, and even like a lot of the thrash metals like Metallica, Judas Priest, and Iron Maiden, they had a lot of these longer stretches of songs, but this was the first one where just the technicality of the playing styles are just fantastic. Yeats Jam being one of the staple songs off this album that are still being played today. Only a Matter of Time is a fantastic tune that I'm so glad they ended this album off with. And some of the other tracks on this guy, like A Fortune of Lies, and probably my favorite track off of this album of Afterlife, these guys just showcase the talent, the raw talent that these kids have, because I mean, really, they were kids at the time of writing this album. So a great debut album, but they had a lot of great things to come after this. Another album that I'm not too familiar with. It's an interesting album. They were trying a little bit more on the mainstream side. They were trying a little bit on the accessibility side, and the band was also going through a little bit of turbulence at this time as well. Kevin Moore had left on keyboards, which left a pretty big vacuum, and so they got Derek Sherman on keyboards and had been touring with him just to feel him out, seeing how things worked out. And this is the only album with Derek on the keyboards. This is a transitional album, if nothing else. I feel like, unlike a lot of the other albums on this list, this one doesn't have like a solidified identity. Outside of the self-titled work, which has no identity at all, this one is, I don't know, it's wavering a little bit. The reason why it's so high on the list for me, and why it didn't, come in a little bit earlier, are just some of the tracks that we have on here, because even though I feel like this album does have some of the weaker tracks within Dream Theater's discography, You Not Me, New Millennium, and Burning My Soul, Take Away My Pain to some extent, and Just Let Me Breathe, these guys are definitely the weaker of the Dream Theater's whole library of tracks, but it does have a lot of the stronger ones as well. My favorite track on this album by far is Peruvian Skies, and I love when they play this live, and within the first part of the song they introduce a line from Pink Floyd, and then in the later points on the track they'll put in something from Metallica, and it really blends the two ideologies of what makes up Dream Theater, because I feel like within this point, they were kind of going through a little bit of an identity crisis. They had reached critical acclaim with the past two albums that preceded this. They didn't quite know where to go from here, so with Peruvian Skies, it was like they were reevaluating who they were by looking at their influences. This doesn't really fit that mold with New Millennium and Lines in the Sand, as well as Trial of Tears, which are kind of the staple tracks on this album, and they're kind of hit and miss for me. I'm not a real big fan of these tracks, but they are strong tracks. And you also have some standout ballads. Ann Lee, as well as Hollow Years, are just two of my favorite ballads. And I'm glad that they were able to plunk these guys down. Okay, let's talk about this album. So this was the first album that doesn't have Mike Portnoy on drums, and the title definitely reflects that, a dramatic turn of events. There wasn't really too much drama leading up to this album. It was just Portnoy wanted a little bit of a break, the rest of the band didn't, so they carried on without him. What we have here, in my mind, is Images and Words Part 2. It really follows the same template that Images and Words did. On the Back of Angels is really just Pull Me Under reimagined. and Breaking All Illusions is just Learning to Live all over again. The other tracks within this kind of follow that same style, but where Images and Words had a really great dichotomy, like a very good contrast. The Dramatic Turn of Events, it really doesn't. Like some of the slower tracks on here, Far From Heaven, Beneath the Surface, This Is the Life, they are not great. Build Me Up, Break Me Down just is very unimaginative, and I'm just like, what are you guys doing? This is basically like new metal, and we've already covered all this. It does have some fantastic moments as well, but I feel like within a lot of these fantastic moments, they don't capture what's really golden. Like there's a lot of shifting and sifting of music to get to those nuggets, and for like the kernel of this is Outcry, and there's this moment where I'm like, there's brilliance, and then they skirt around. Like they're like, okay, we're heading to it, oh, here's brilliance, oh, okay, bye brilliance, we're going to try something else. I'm like, what are you doing? You had brilliance, why not do something with it? And I feel like this was similar throughout the album as well. Lost Not Forgotten does have one of my favorite playing between Petrucci and Rudis. Within the guitars and within the keyboards, their playing style is just so tight, and it just keeps going. Like every time I think, okay, they're going to stop, they keep going. The only problem with this track is once that introduction is done, the rest of the track's kind of unimaginative. Bridges in the Sky is probably by far the strongest track from start to finish, like in its entirety. That is a very meaty track, and probably the only reason why this album got so high on the like closer to the best. It's the essence and the playing styles that they have, and those kernels, those brilliant moments that do make me come back and enjoy the album more. Okay, the last album to feature, in my mind, the dream team of Dream Theater. Mike Portnoy's is still on the drum kit, and this, in my mind, is the most personal album that the band has ever really put out. In my mind, it's the album where a lot of things almost happen. With A Nightmare to Remember, it's about a car crash where people almost die. In The Count of Tuscany, it's the song where a kid almost does a lot of things. A Rite of Passage and Wither are not good. I mean, A Rite of Passage is fun. Wither is kind of the flip side to that, but it's just like these guys just, I don't know, they don't do anything for me. Shattered Fortress is a great closing to the AA suite, and The Best of Times has one of the most heartfelt Petrucci guitar playings I've ever heard. It's really for those two tracks that has pushed this album so close to the better as opposed to the not so good side of things. And even though Mike Portnoy should never be allowed to growl, I still enjoy Nightmare to Remember. Each of the albums prior to this chronologically, to probably about Metropolis, I'd say, have like a single word that you can boil down to their essence, and this is a very contrasting album. Like that's the word that I use for this album. It's a very contrasting album, as well as very personal, as I already mentioned. Alright, so we're coming into more of the classic albums here. This is the early Dream Theater. This is the last of the early Dream Theater with Awake. Probably the first realized concept album, and I like the fact that this album is divided into two parts. You have the first part, which goes from the first track of 6 o'clock all the way into the that song, with Voices and The Silent Man. And within the second half of this album, with The Mirror and Lies bleeding into one another, Lifting Shadows Off a Dream starting off very heavy and then working its way into being a little bit softer, Scared being just a fantastic and then having Space Divest being that closing piece. Up to this point was their heaviest work, and it has such great heaviness off of it. It's also the last album to feature Kevin Moore.
Across the crooked step.
Okay, so this guy holds a very special spot in my heart. This, in my mind, is their heaviest album to date. Each of these albums, from all the way to like Black Clouds and Silver Linings, all the way from Metropolis, each album kind of can be boiled down into one word essence, and the word that I have on here is raw. It is, again, a very much a concept album of that kind of stream of thought. It also holds some of the most meaty aspects of the band up to that point. Honor Thy Father is, once we get to that Don't Cross the Crooked Step, and it hits that, I love that. I friggin' love that. The Stream of Consciousness, the purely instrumental, was one of the first songs I heard from Dream Theater, and that's why it's a little bit of a personal touch as well. And I mean, the other tracks on this they do kind of bleed into one another, and they don't really wiggle too far from the center. I will admit, In the Name of God, once we get into that noodling on the guitar and keyboards, it's pretty much just straight up wankery. I still enjoy it. I still love it, and it's such an odd playing style that Petrucci and Rudess are using that I can't help but at least love it a little bit. I'm gonna get hate mail for this one, but I gotta stay true to myself. Images and Words. Let's talk about this guy. This was their sophomore album and the one that put them on the map. This holds a lot of their standout tracks and those tracks that put them on the map. I mean, especially Pull Me Under, Learning to Live, and Metropolis Part 1. These guys solidified them as a progressive metal legend. Again, it put them on the map, and it really sparked the progressive metal movement. There's no bad song on this album, but in my mind, they've done better. I'm sorry, I know I'm going to get flack for this, but in my mind they have. Yeah, it doesn't really connect too much with me outside of just their individual songs, and that's another reason. The individual songs work better as individual songs as opposed to a full-length album. And it's not until we find Awake where that album is starting to flourish as an album as opposed to individual songs, and then from there we have concept album after concept album after concept album. And so that's why I kind of put that guy here.
He's a Monday morning lunatic.
Okay, we're coming into the final stretch with 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence. Now, this guy, again, holds a very special point in my heart. The title track, I consider it one track, is one that I really needed when it first came out. It told me that I wasn't alone, and I kind of needed that. It also started the album off with the first track for the AA suite for Mike Portnoy, where it's really like his road to recovery and the 12 steps within Alcoholics Anonymous, with Glass Prison taking, I believe it's the first 3 steps. And each song does something very different, and that's why the word that I use for this one is experimental, because it's a very experimental album. The 6th track, being the 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence, is just pure epic. And then we have Glass Prison, which in and of itself is an experiment. Blind Faith is itself a experiment, being such a lighter track after such a heavy one. Misunderstanding is one of my favorite tracks by the band, it being such a great build-up and a great payoff at the end. And Disappear is probably the most lamenting song of the group so far. Of course, 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence. How can you not love this song? And the payoff at the end is so potent. Again, I'm gonna get some hate for this. Okay, at number 3, so high up on a lot of other people's very low albums, Systematic Chaos. Yeah, let me explain myself for this. The word that I would use for this is meaty. This is a meaty album. It's the first album that when the boys went into the studio to write, record, and produce, they didn't have an idea of it coming in. The only idea that they had was that it had to have balls. In fact, I believe, The Dark Eternal Night originally was called, like, Nads. All the albums from this, like the last 4 or 5 albums, they had a clear concept of what they wanted to do, and because they freed themselves of that confining constraint, they were able to really flourish within the music, and I friggin' love this. Right from the start with In the Presence of Enemies, that overture that we have for this entire album sets the stage perfectly. It also has some of my favorite tracks. Part 1 and Part 2 of In the Presence of Enemies. Okay, Forsaken, I'm going to leave that at the door. It's not a good track, but it's about a vampire, so it's back on the tracks. because I freaking love vampires, and a song about vampires is always aces in my book, even if it's the weakest track off the album. Constant Motion is a fun track. It really processes like the OCD, ADHD aspect of the band, where just your mind is in constant motion and you can't break out of it. I thought the playing style in that was perfectly represented on that. The Dark Eternal Night, I love that meaty hook, that how can you not love that? It's so meaty and it's so Prophets of War, again, not the biggest fan. It's their political song, and up to this point, I know a lot of the albums had this. The Great Debate was found in 6 Degrees, and Sacrifice Sons on Octavarium, so it's not new for the band to take on a song like this, and it also holds one of my favorite songs of all time, being The Ministry of Lost Souls. This is probably... I keep going back onto what my favorite song is, but this is probably my favorite song from the band. It's just so heart-wrenching. I love the play out. Whenever I hear it, I have to stop and close my eyes and just get enveloped in it. And the jam session on this also is just dripping in brilliance. This one hurt to put at number 2. Originally it was number 1. And I'd been going back and forth for quite a while as to what my number 1 album was, but I had to put things on the table and really look at it and find out what was the stronger album. And this one did fall short just because of some of the weaker tracks off of this album, because this album, even though it's my favorite album from Dream Theater, and I will go on the record and say it's my favorite album, it was the first album that I picked up from the band, and it's the one that made me fall in love with the band. But it does have some of the weaker tracks. The Answer Lies Within, These Walls, and I Walk Beside You, the 3 tracks on this, they are less than stellar. Songs such as The Root of All Evil, continuing the concept and song of the AA Suite, Panic Attack being such a hard-hitting song, Never Enough, I still love. It does feel very much like a Muse track, but I love once we get into that echoey guitar playing near the end. Sacrifice Sons being that political track, my favorite track from all of Dream Theater's discography, Octavarium. Now let's talk about this album in terms of the concept, because that's really where this album shines. The concept had been building since Metropolis, and if you don't believe me, 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence had 6 tracks. Train of Thought had 7 tracks. This has 8 tracks. 8 tracks being Octavarium, and just the amount of Easter eggs hidden in this album, I could dedicate a full hour and I still wouldn't cover them all. Maybe I will one day. This isn't really the place for it. All that I can say is that the concept is brilliant and it was executed masterfully. Each song is rooted in a different key of the scale of the 8 scales, which is why there's 8 tracks, and Octavarium is by far their best epic and probably their best song as well.
Open your eyes, Nicholas.
Metropolis Part 2, Scenes from a Memory. Okay, let's talk about this guy. Concept album, and probably the most straightforward concept album that the band has ever done. Continuation of Metropolis Part 1 from Images and Words, and I love this. I love the fact that they took one of their strongest songs up to that point, their strongest album, and just made it into a full-length song. Now, I know originally this was planned to be a 20-minute epic that would be found on Falling Into Infinity, but it just didn't quite fit. This is also the first album to hold, again, my mind, the Dream Team. Derek left the band. In his absence, we have Jordan Rudess, who had been playing with Mike Portnoy and Petrucci with Liquid Tension Experiment. So they brought him in, and oh man, it just fit. It just worked so well. The entirety of this album from start to finish is their strongest work, and that's why in my mind it's number 1. The Spirit Carries On. I can't listen to this track without being very emotional near the end. And finally Free, with that big twist at the end of the song. It's the strongest album by far, and it's why I keep coming back to it. Much like Octavarium, I could talk about this album for a full hour and still not touch everything. So I'm going to leave it there. There's my worst to best of Dream Theater's albums. It took me quite a while to really hunker down and get right, but I feel like I got it right for what reflects my own personal tastes. What are yours? Let me know of your own worst to best of Dream Theater albums by commenting down below. I can almost guarantee you it's not the same, so I'd love to hear of your own thoughts by commenting down below. And that's about it. Thank you guys so much for joining me on this one. I know it's a longer one, but it's one that I had a blast really diving into. Again, thank you guys so much for watching. You guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.